sometimes when you lose something, it's really hard to get it back. I remember one time my phone fell in my pocket and it fell in between the seats in my car. And it fell into that spot where your hand doesn't quite fit. And it doesn't matter how far forward or far back you move the seat, you can't quite reach it. It's in that in between zone where there's just no way to get at something. I remember working for 20, 30 minutes, like with a stick, a pencil, whatever I could find, just to kind of sweep back and forth until finally I flipped the phone over one time and it was just to the right spot where I could reach my fingers in and pull it up. And sometimes we work really hard to get back something that we've lost because we actually value it. And it's cost us something. It costs us a little bit of time or a little bit of our energy or some resources if we have to buy it back. Because losing things isn't always funny. It's not always fun in games. Sometimes we lose something valuable. Maybe you lost something you really cared about, or you broke something that didn't belong to you, or something that you knew you could never replace. It was one of a kind, or it was sentimental. It meant something to you, and you knew that once you lost it, it was never going to be the same, and you were not going to be able to replace it. Specifically in this series, we've been talking about what it looks like when we're lost, when we feel far from God, disconnected. And today we're going to hear a story about a young man who lost everything. But he didn't lose anything because of outside forces that were working on his life or because his life was difficult. Instead, he lost everything because of his own poor decision making. Throughout this series, we've been looking at just one chapter of the Bible, just one chapter, Luke chapter 15. And in this chapter of the Bible, Jesus tells a series of stories about things that were lost and that were then found. And these stories aren't historical stories. They're not things that actually happened, but instead they were parables, stories that Jesus told to help illustrate a point that he was trying to get across about what life was like with God or when you're disconnected from God. And Jesus told these stories to a group of religious leaders who were probably well-intentioned, but had missed the point. These religious leaders were called the Pharisees, and they had become arrogant and self-righteous and dismissive and even abusive of people who thought differently than them, people who lived differently than them. And so Jesus tells this series of stories because he wants them to understand what God actually values and how God actually views people. The first story was about a man who had 100 sheep and one of them wanders off. And we see that the shepherd pursues the lost sheep and carefully, lovingly brings it back to safety. Next, Jesus told a story about a woman who lost one of her 10 coins. And he was trying to tell the Pharisees that God doesn't give up on us when we're lost. Instead, he's willing to tear apart the house and keep looking for us because God values you. So God notices you and God values you. Today's story is not about an object that was lost, but about a son that was lost. Jesus tells a story of a young man who had an older brother and a father, and he goes to the father and says, "Dad, give me my inheritance." And to us, that may not seem like a big deal. We probably ask our parents for money all the time. But in this culture, he's essentially saying to his dad, "Dad, I wish you were dead, and I think I'm better off on my own. Give me the money you're going to owe me when you're actually dead so I can go live how I want." And so he leaves home with this money from his dad, rejecting his family, breaking his dad's heart. And he goes off and he does whatever he wants. And we're going to pick up in his story in Luke chapter 15, looking at verses 14 through 19. This is what it says. Then after he had spent everything, a severe famine took place in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and worked for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. And he was longing to eat the carob pods the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired workers have food enough to spare, but here I am dying from hunger? I will get up and go to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired workers.'" See, this son he behaves in a way that a lot of us can relate to. He's impulsive. Like he just rushes in, and he's probably angry or frustrated with his family or his dad, but he's impulsive in his decision making, and he asks for something that doesn't really understand what he's asking for. And he's hurtful to his family. He basically says to his dad, "Dad, you're worth more to me dead than alive." I can't imagine what it would have felt like as a father to hear those words. And this son is selfish. He's only thinking about himself this entire time. For a while, he probably lived the kind of life he dreamed of until he couldn't anymore. See, the famine come, people lost their jobs, and eventually he finds himself struggling to even find food to eat. And he ends up working for a pig farmer, and he was willing to eat the food that the pigs were eating. Now, there's something we need to understand about the context of the story. Remember, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. These are religious leaders who thought that pigs were unclean animals. They were forbidden by God. And while the son in this story, he ate with the pigs, the Pharisees would have seen this, even being this close to this pig, as a sin against God. And you might feel compassion for this son, but the Pharisees would have been disgusted by his behavior. This son ended up with nothing. He feels shame and guilt and desperation, so much so that he's willing to go back to his dad and just beg for scraps. And that's where the story picks up in verse 20 through 24. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way from home, his father saw him and his heart went out to him. He ran and hugged his son and kissed him. Then his son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his slaves, "Hurry, bring the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate, because this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Can you imagine, after mistreating your family and rejecting them so boldly, to be welcomed home like this? He wasted all of his dad's money. He disgraced his family. He's bringing shame on himself. And his father is still moved that when he sees him, he runs to him and embraces him and welcomes him back home. Just like Jesus was angry with the Pharisees for being judgmental towards others, I wonder if there are steps that we could take to be more welcoming when people walk away from God. When people feel distant and disconnected from God, are there ways that we can be more welcoming to them? I don't know how much you right now need Jesus to welcome you back. But I want you to know that God notices when you're gone, that God values you, and that God is waiting, arms open, ready to embrace you as a child when you're ready to come home. And if you need to hear that, I want you to know that you are loved by God. But we also have a responsibility to be just as welcoming as the Father is. God calls us to welcome people back, even when they've wandered off, even when they've made mistakes, even when they have ruined their own lives. We need to be welcoming, accepting, loving, kind, and gracious. And when you find yourself not being welcoming to someone who's wandered far from God, I hope that you remember the truth that Jesus shared with these Pharisees.